Kang Du-hyun was on one knee on the rooftop terrace of the Marchetti Hotel in Busan, a ring box open in his palm, 40 guests holding their breath around him. When the service door at the far end of the terrace banged open, and two 10-year-old boys came sprinting through it, chasing a runaway balloon. He didn't look at them at first. Nobody did. A rooftop wedding proposal has its own gravity, and every eye in that garden was fixed on him and on Yoon, who stood in front of him with her hand pressed to her mouth, waiting for the words he hadn't finished saying. Then the boys skidded to a stop 6 feet from the string quartet, and the woman who came through the door after them, breathless, apologizing to no one in particular, froze completely. Du-hyun's mouth went dry before his mind caught up to why. She was wearing a green dress he didn't recognize. Her hair was different, shorter, natural, threaded through with 2 silver strands at the temple that hadn't been there 10 years ago. But he would have known that stillness anywhere, the specific way she went quiet instead of loud when something startled her. Amara Whitfield stood at the edge of his engagement, 10 years and 1 ocean away from where he'd last seen her, and on either side of her stood 2 boys who had his jaw, his eyebrows, and a face that was unmistakably, undeniably his own at that age. The ring box was still open in his hand. Yoon was still waiting for an answer to a question he had now completely forgotten how to finish. Du-hyun SSI, she said quietly. He closed the box without looking at it and stood up. That was the moment. Not the flight 10 years earlier, not the divorce papers, not any of it. This was the moment the floor of his life actually opened, on a rooftop in Busan, in front of 40 witnesses, with a balloon drifting up into the evening sky above all their heads. Amara grabbed both boys by the shoulder in the same motion, already turning them back toward the door. Malik, Josiah. Now her voice had the flat, immediate authority of a mother who had spent a decade being the only adult in the room. That's the coordinator's fault, she said to the terrace at large, not quite looking at anyone, already moving. We were told the east stairwell was clear. I am so sorry. She was 3 steps from the door when Du-hyun said her name, just that. Amara. She stopped like she'd hit glass. 40 guests turned to look at him, and then, slowly at her, doing the math that people at parties do when a single word changes the temperature of a room. Yoon hand had not moved from her mouth. Her father, Chairman Yoon Tae-sik, standing near the champagne table with the proprietary comfort of a man who considered himself the most important person present, went very still. Amara turned around. She looked at Du-hyun the way you look at a debt you thought had been settled and just discovered was still on the books. Not here, she said quietly. Then where, he said, because I am not letting you walk out that door again without an address this time. Something crossed her face, not fear. He would think about that detail for weeks afterward, not fear at all. Something closer to exhaustion, like she had always known this conversation was coming and had simply hoped it would wait a few more years. They're 10, she said, nodding down at the boys, who were watching the entire exchange with the frank, unblinking attention children have before they learn to look away from adult tension. They don't know anything. I would like to keep it that way for one more night. Amara, the Golden Pier Bakery, she said, Yonge District, Tuesday morning, 7 o'clock before we open. Come alone. She looked past him, briefly, at Yoon, and something like an apology moved across her face before she turned it back into nothing. I'm sorry to have interrupted your evening. Then she took her son's hands and walked out, and the door swung shut behind her. And Kang Du-hyun stood on the terrace holding a ring box that suddenly felt like it weighed 40 pounds, with absolutely no idea how to finish the sentence he'd started 5 minutes earlier. His head of security, Oh Byung-chul, 61 years old, gray at the temples, the kind of man who had ironed his own funeral suit years in advance because he liked to be prepared, found him 20 minutes later standing alone at the edge of the terrace with his back to the party, the ring box in his jacket pocket, the city lights spread out below him like something indifferent. Byung-chul had served Du-hyun's father for 18 years before he'd served Du-hyun for the 12 since. He had been in the room the night the old man died, had put a hand on 19-year-old Du-hyun's shoulder and told him the organization was his now, that he was ready, that everything would be fine. Du-hyun had believed him completely. He had trusted him with contracts, with codes, with the invisible architecture that kept an empire from collapsing. He had trusted him with Amara. Clear the terrace, Du-hyun said, without turning around. everyone. Now, Byung-chul's face did the thing it always did when he was buying time to think, a small stillness, like a screen freezing for half a second before it catches up. Sajang-nim, the guests, I said everyone. The terrace emptied in under 10 minutes. Yunariam left last, pausing at the door long enough to look back at him with an expression he couldn't read, not hurt exactly, something more clinical. Like she was recalculating a spreadsheet in real time. Chairman Yoon left without pretending to be gracious about it. When the last caterer had gone, and the terrace was empty except for uneaten canapes and half-full champagne flutes going warm in the evening air, Do Hyun turned to Byung-chul. 10 years ago, he said, you told me Amara left on her own, that she signed the papers, packed her things, and asked me specifically not to follow her. You told me my father agreed it was for the best and that pursuing her would only make things worse for everyone, including her. Byung-chul said nothing. She has twins, Do Hyun said. 10 years old, do the math yourself, Byung-chul, because I already have. The older man's jaw moved, almost imperceptibly. Sajang-nim, how long have you known? A pause that lasted exactly one beat too long to be innocent. I carried out an instruction from your father, Byung-chul said finally, choosing each word like he was diffusing something. That is all I am prepared to say to you tonight, in this state, on this terrace. Do Hyun nodded once slow, the nod of a man committing something to a ledger he intends to collect on later. Go home, he said, don't call anyone, don't move a single file. Tomorrow, 7 a.m. my office. You will tell me everything, every name, every payment, every person who touched this. If I find out you spent tonight protecting yourself instead of preparing to tell me the truth, you will not enjoy what happens after. Byung-chul bowed, the precise, formal bow of a man who understood exactly how much mercy he had just been given and how little of it he deserved. Then he left, and Do Hyun was alone on a terrace full of cooling food, holding a ring meant for a woman he now realized he had proposed to as a kind of surrender, a decision made not out of love, but out of the exhausted belief that the one thing he'd actually wanted was gone for good. He didn't sleep. At 2 in the morning, he let himself into the locked archive room in the sub-basement of the family's holding company. A room his father's lawyer had always described as containing nothing but old property records and expired contracts. It took him 3 hours to find the drawer with the false bottom, and another 20 minutes to convince himself he was actually seeing what was in it. A wire transfer receipt, 400 million won, dated 10 years and 2 weeks before he'd been told Amara left him. Recipient, a private relocation consultancy registered in Gwangju, the kind of company that existed for exactly one purpose and dissolved itself within a year of using it. Memo line, matter closed. A photograph of Amara at Incheon Airport, visibly pregnant, a suitcase at her feet, an unfamiliar man in a dark suit standing close enough beside her to make clear he wasn't there by accident. And a letter, 4 sentences, in his father's unmistakable handwriting. The American girl is carrying a complication this family will not absorb into its name. She has been relocated with appropriate discretion. She will not attempt further contact. This matter is closed and will not be raised again by anyone under this roof. Do Hyun read it 3 times. His father had been dead for 3 years. There was nowhere to send the rage that letter deserved, no door to knock on, no man to sit across from and demand an answer from. So he did what he had trained himself to do with anger that had no living target. He folded it back along its original crease, put it back in the envelope, and set it aside with the discipline of someone who understood that unfocused fury was the most expensive thing a man in his position could afford to spend. Then he looked for a long time at the photograph of Amara at the airport, one hand resting flat against the swell of her stomach, and understood that she had been carrying his sons through an airport alone, believing, because his own family had made absolutely sure she would believe it, that he had chosen to let her go. Byung-chul arrived at the office at 6:58 the next morning, 2 minutes early, which told Do Hyun more than any apology could have. The old man had spent the night rehearsing. He sat across the desk with his hands folded, and for the first time in 12 years, did not meet Do Hyun's eyes while he spoke. Your father called me into this same building the week he found out, Byung-chul said. Not this office, the old one, before the renovation. He told me Amara SSI was pregnant, and he told me it wasn't a discussion. He said a foreign woman with no family name behind her could not be allowed to attach herself to this house, pregnancy or not. And that I was the only person he trusted to make the problem disappear without it becoming a scandal that would follow you for the rest of your life. So you made her disappear. I made her safe. Byung-chul said. And for the first time, there was something raw underneath the careful formality. That was the lie I told myself, Sajang-nim. I told her personally that you had agreed to the arrangement. That you'd asked for space. That you didn't want to be the reason a woman with no standing in this world was dragged through what your family would have put her through if she'd stayed and fought it publicly. I believed at the time that I was protecting both of you from something worse. You believed a lie you invented yourself. Yes, Byung-chul didn't flinch from it. I have had 10 years to understand that. I told myself every year that the moment had passed, that reopening it would only cause more damage than leaving it buried. That was cowardice wearing the costume of loyalty. I see that now, watching you these past 2 days. I did not see it before. Du Hyan sat with that for a long moment. The anger he'd carried onto the terrace 2 nights earlier had not left him, but it had changed shape. It wasn't hot anymore. It was something colder and more permanent. The kind of anger that reorganizes a relationship instead of ending it in a single blow. You'll give my lawyer every document, every name, every payment record connected to this, Du Hyan said, not because it changes anything. Because Amara has a right to a complete account. And because my sons will ask questions someday that deserve real answers instead of the version that's convenient for this family. Understood. And you'll stay on, Du Hyan said. Watching the older man's head come up in genuine surprise, not because I've forgiven you. Because you're the only person in this organization who was in the room both times my father made a decision that broke something, and the only one honest enough, apparently, to eventually say so out loud. I need someone who remembers what this family is capable of when nobody's watching. I'd rather that person be you, ashamed and useful, than someone new who hasn't learned the lesson yet. Byung-chul bowed low from his seat, and when he straightened, his eyes were wet in a way Du Hyan had never once seen in 12 years of knowing him. I failed you both, he said. I will spend whatever time I have left trying to be worth the mercy you're extending me tonight. Don't spend it on me, Du Hyan said. Spend it making sure nothing like that letter ever gets written in this house again. The Golden Pier Bakery was a narrow storefront on a quiet corner in Yonge. Flour dust caught gold in the early light through the front window. Du Hyan arrived at 6:52, 8 minutes early, and found Amara already there alone, sleeves pushed up. Kneading a mound of dough on the steel counter with the unhurried rhythm of someone who had done this every morning for years. She didn't look up when the bell over the door rang. You're early, she said. You said 7, I know what I said. She folded the dough over itself, pressed, turned it a quarter turn, folded again. I set a proofing timer for 22 minutes before I started this batch. When it goes off, you're done. That's how long you get. She reached into her apron pocket and slid a folded piece of paper across the counter without looking up from the dough. He recognized the paper before he opened it, a school permission slip, the boys' names printed at the top, the back of it covered in her handwriting. He read it standing up. 1. No contact with Malik or Josiah until I decide otherwise. No visits, no gifts, no accidental appearances outside their school. 2. Whatever investigation you run into what your family did, I want every document, not a summary. Everything unedited. 3. The engagement ends this week. I don't need details on how. That's yours to manage. 4. No security detail near my building or the bakery. If I ever spot someone watching my street, I take my sons and you will never find us again. I've had 10 years of practice at disappearing. He looked up. Rule 4 is a problem, he said. There are people connected to my organization who might see you and the boys as leverage now that I'm asking questions out loud. I can't in good conscience leave you exposed. She finally looked at him. Are you negotiating my own list with me? He closed his mouth. There's a pen behind the register, she said. Sign it or leave before the timer goes off. He signed it. She folded the paper without checking his signature and slid it into her apron, and for a moment the only sound in the bakery was the low mechanical hum of the proofer against the wall. There's something you should know, she said, still not looking at him, working the dough again. I found out about Byung-chul 3 years ago. A friend who does forensic accounting flagged the transfer for me, out of nowhere, no reason she should have even been looking. I didn't say anything. I didn't reach out. I wanted to see if you'd ever find it yourself. Amara, that was the only test that ever mattered to me, she said, not whether you were sorry. Whether you were paying attention, the proofer chimed, 22 minutes. I'll send you the investigation files as I get them, he said. Send them to a lawyer, not to me directly. I don't want your handwriting anywhere near my kitchen table yet. She wiped her hands on her apron, and for the first time, met his eyes fully. You have until Malik stops flinching every time a black car slows down near his school. That's the only clock that matters. Not mine, not yours, his. She went back to the dough. He understood he had been dismissed, and he let himself out, and it was only once he was 3 blocks away that he realized his hands were shaking. Ending the engagement cost Du-hyun 48 hours and something more expensive than money. He called Chairman Yoon directly, no lawyer, no intermediary, no carefully drafted statement from the family's communications office. He said the engagement was over, the decision was final, and that he was prepared to discuss any business consequences whenever the chairman wished, but that this particular matter was closed. Chairman Yoon was quiet for a long moment. You understand what you're walking away from, he said finally. I've walked away from worse without understanding it, Du-hyun said. I'm trying to walk toward something for once instead. The call ended there. What happened next was the specific, quiet cruelty of a powerful man who had just been publicly diminished and had no intention of absorbing it gracefully. Chairman Yoon didn't hold a press conference. He made one phone call to a tabloid contact he'd used before and gave him 2 pieces of information, a description of the woman from the rooftop and the district she lived in. The reporter started making calls within a day. Yoon Aryum found out about her father's move that same evening because she had spent years quietly cultivating her own sources inside his operation, a habit she'd never mentioned to anyone. She sat with the information for exactly 1 hour. Then she did something her father had spent 30 years failing to predict, because he had never once accurately understood what kind of woman his daughter had actually become. She drove to Yonge herself. She found the bakery the way anyone could find a business with a public storefront. She simply looked it up. She walked in at 6:40 the next morning, sat down at the small table by the window, and waited. Amara came out from the back at 7, saw her, and stopped for exactly 1 second before continuing to the proofer to check the dough. You have until this timer goes off, Amara said, not turning around. 22 minutes, Aryum almost smiled despite herself. You already know about the rule. I know that my ex-husband's ex-fiancé is sitting in my bakery at 7 in the morning, Amara said, which means either you're here to threaten me, or something worse is happening, and you decided I should hear it from you instead of from a newspaper. The second one. Aryum set a thin folder on the table and slid it across. Your name, your address, the bakery, your son's school. My father gave it to a reporter yesterday morning. The story runs within the week, unless someone stops it. Amara didn't reach for the folder immediately. Why are you telling me this? Because my father is using 2 10-year-old boys to punish a man who embarrassed him at a party. And I refuse to be the reason their names end up in print. Aryum paused. And because I read the file Du-hyun's lawyer sent over, what was done to you 10 years ago wasn't a business decision. It was cruelty with paperwork attached. Amara finally sat down across from her. Her face didn't change, but her jaw tightened once when she reached the page in the folder with the boys' school photos on it. What are you going to do? I'm going to have a conversation with my father tonight that he is not going to enjoy, Aryum said. I've been his chief strategist for 6 years. I've signed off on things I shouldn't have because I believed in the company we were building together. I've also kept very good records. She stood and picked up her bag. He will not touch your sons. Not a story, not a phone call to their school, nothing. I needed you to know it was coming, so that if I'm wrong about my own leverage, you have time to move first. Amara was quiet for a moment. You're not what I expected. No one ever is. Aryum moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the frame. Tell Du-hyun the engagement is over on my end too. I'll handle my father in my own time, my own way. He doesn't need to call me. She looked back once, and tell him something else. Tell him the only version of this that ends well is the one where he stops trying to run an empire and starts learning how to be somebody's father. Everything else is just noise he's using to avoid the hard part. She left. Amara sat alone with the folder for a long moment, then picked up her phone and called Duhayan for the first time since the bakery. Yoon Ariam was just here, she said when he picked up. Your fiancé, ex-fiancé, her father's trying to sell your sons to a tabloid. She's handling it. Don't contact her, she was clear about that. A pause. Is she all right? She's the most prepared person I've dealt with all week, Amara said. Make sure her name is protected in whatever your people say publicly about the breakup. She didn't earn any of this. She hung up before he could answer. That night, Ariam walked into her father's study and set a folder of her own on his desk without a word. He opened it, read 2 pages, and went very still. You'd use this against your own family, he said. I'd protect this family from itself, she said. If that story runs, if either of those boys is named anywhere, if a single person shows up near that bakery because of information you gave a reporter, this folder goes to a lawyer in Singapore. A journalist I trust more than yours, and the tax authority. Simultaneously, she met his eyes without flinching. I love you, Appa. I will not let you do this to children. He didn't speak for a long time. The reporter gets called off by morning, he said finally. She nodded, picked up the folder, and walked out. She didn't cry until she reached the parking garage, and then she allowed herself exactly 10 minutes before she drove home. Amara waited 3 days before she told the boys anything. On a quiet Saturday morning, with the light coming in sideways across the kitchen table, she sat them both down before breakfast was finished and asked them to listen to everything before either one said a word. She told them the truth, unsoftened, who their father was, what his family had done 10 years ago, why she'd left the country, and why she'd finally come back to Busan once she'd saved enough and healed enough to risk it. She told them she hadn't said anything sooner because she'd needed to be certain, and that she was certain now. The kitchen went very quiet when she finished. Josiah, the younger by 4 minutes, spoke first, the way he always did, before he'd finished thinking it through and somehow landing close to the truth anyway. Does he know about us now? He does now, Amara said. He didn't before. What happened was his family's doing, not his, though he's the one who has to prove that to you, not just say it. Josiah considered this. He's a mafia boss, though. That's part of it, yes. Is that bad? It's complicated, she said. Most things worth understanding usually are. Malik hadn't said anything yet. He'd been sitting with his hands flat on the table, staring at a fixed point somewhere between his cereal bowl and the edge of the table, processing the way he always processed things, slow. Internal, thorough. He looked up at his mother. I don't want to meet him, he said, and stood up from the table. The kitchen went completely silent. Amara didn't rush to fill it. She looked at her older son and waited, the way she'd learned to wait for the things that mattered. He left, Malik said. You raised us by yourself. You worked doubles at 2 jobs before you saved enough for the bakery. We moved twice before we found somewhere safe, and you never once complained where we could hear it. And now, because he saw us at some party, he just gets to show up, and I'm supposed to what, be grateful? No, Amara said. You're not supposed to be anything. That was never how this was going to work. I'm not asking you to forgive him, she went on. I'm not asking you to welcome him in. I'm telling you the truth because you're old enough to hear it, and because I promised both of you the day you were born I'd never lie to you about anything that mattered. What you do with the truth is yours to decide, not mine, definitely not his. Malik sat back down. He didn't say anything else, but the tension in his jaw stayed through the rest of breakfast. Josiah reached over and quietly stole a piece of toast off his brother's plate. Malik let him. The days after that were quiet but not easy. Malik went to school, came home, did his homework, ate dinner, polite, contained, clearly living inside a decision he wasn't ready to revisit. Josiah watched him the way he always watched people, sideways and patient. On the 4th night, Josiah found his brother sitting alone at the kitchen table after everyone else had gone to bed, a mug of cold barley tea in front of him that he wasn't drinking. You're still thinking about it, Josiah said, sitting across from him. I'm always thinking about it. Josiah was quiet a moment. Remember when we were 7 and you cracked Uma's phone screen and hid it under your mattress for 2 days because you were scared she'd be mad? What does that have to do with anything? She wasn't mad, Josiah said. She was just sad you didn't trust her enough to tell her right away. He paused. I don't think you're actually angry at him. I think you're scared. Malik didn't answer right away. Scared of what? That you'll let him in and then he'll disappear again, and this time you'll actually remember it happening. Josiah shrugged. That's not a reason to say no forever, though. It's just a reason to be careful, and we're good at careful. We've had 10 years of practice. Malik didn't say anything else that night. But the next morning at breakfast, he looked at his mother and said, I want to see the investigation files. The ones his lawyer's been sending. Amara went and got her tablet without a word and set it in front of him. He read every document, start to finish, in silence, the way he read everything slowly, without performance. When he finished, he pushed it back across the table. He didn't have to do any of this, he said. The investigation. He could have just shown up at a school pickup and expected us to deal with it. No, Amara said. Not with me he couldn't have. Malik nodded slowly. A long pause. I'm not ready to call him anything, he said finally, but I'll meet him. That's enough, Amara said. That's more than enough. The first meeting happened on a Sunday afternoon at a public park near the harbor, chosen entirely by Amara. She told Duhayan to come alone, to leave the car and drive her 2 blocks away, and to bring nothing but himself. He arrived in a plain jacket, hands in his pockets, and stood at the edge of the walking path like a man who had learned, somewhere in the past month, not to walk into a room like he owned it. Josiah spotted him first and grabbed his brother's sleeve. Malik went very still, the same stillness from the kitchen table, internal and careful. Duhayan stopped several feet away and bowed. Not a shallow, polite tilt of the head, a full, deliberate bow to 2 10-year-old boys in weekend clothes, in a public park, in front of strangers who had no idea who he was. Josiah bowed back immediately. Can you actually fight, or is that just something people say about you? Amara closed her eyes briefly. That's a question I'll answer honestly when you're older, Duhayan said. Josiah seemed to find this acceptable. Malik hadn't bowed. Duhayan didn't prompt him, didn't look to Amara for help. He simply stood there in the afternoon light and waited, giving his son whatever time he needed to decide. Malik looked at him for a long moment, doing the same slow calculation he applied to everything. Then he bowed 15 degrees, no more, a door left slightly open rather than held shut. Duhayan bowed back, lower, without hesitation. They walked the length of the harbor path together over the next 2 hours. It wasn't dramatic. It was careful and ordinary, and, in its own quiet way, real. Malik asked 3 questions he'd clearly prepared in advance, direct and unembellished, and Duhayan answered every one honestly, including the ones that reflected badly on himself. Josiah talked about a video game for 20 straight minutes with no apparent concern for whether anyone was following along. At the end of the walk, Malik stopped and looked up at him. You can come to my science fair next month, he said. You have to stand in the back, though. I don't want it to be about you being there. I'll stand in the back, Duhayan said. Malik nodded once and walked ahead to catch up with his brother. Amara glanced at Duhayan briefly. Something in her expression had shifted, just slightly, the way a door that's been sealed a long time finally moves when the pressure equalizes on both sides. She didn't say anything. She followed her sons. 4 months later, on the morning of the twins' 11th birthday, Amara called him. Come for dinner, she said. Small, just us, and 2 people I trust. Sit at the head of the table, not as a guest, as their father. That's what tonight is. He arrived with a small basket of fruit, because that was what she'd taught him without saying it directly, that arriving correctly mattered more than arriving expensively. The apartment above the bakery was warm and small and full. Mrs. Hand from next door was there, the woman who'd watched the boys through every double shift Amara had ever worked to keep them fed. Amara's sister had flown in from Houston and studied Duhayan for a long, careful moment before stepping aside to let him through the door. The cake was small. The candles said 11. The boys blew them out together the way they always had, except this year there was one more chair at the table. Josiah made the first toast, because Josiah always spoke before he'd finished thinking, and somehow always landed on the truth anyway. To Uma, he said, who did everything. Then, without rehearsal, without any drama in his voice at all, the way children say things once they've simply decided they're true, and to Appa, who came back. Malik raised his cup second. He looked directly at Duhayan, the same clear, unperformed look from the harbor path. Not to who tried, he said, not to who showed up once. To who's still learning. He paused, present tense, ongoing. It wasn't forgiveness delivered as a verdict. It was a door left open on the boy's own terms at the boy's own pace. Du Hyun raised his cup. His hands were steady. He'd spent 4 months learning, one back row science fair and one honest answer at a time, how to hold something carefully instead of trying to control it. He didn't make a speech. He looked at his sons, and then at the woman who had raised them into people worth knowing entirely without him, and he said the only thing that felt true: "Thank you for this seat." That was all. It was enough, because that's the difference between a man and a boy wearing a man's title. A boy makes the moment he arrives the whole story. A man understands that arriving is only the beginning, and that the real work is every ordinary Tuesday that comes after, the ones nobody's watching, the ones with no ring box, no rooftop. No audience at all. If this one stayed with you, if you've ever believed some things have to be rebuilt slow, and that slow isn't the same thing as lost, stay with us for the next one. Drop a comment and tell me, when Malik raised his cup and said, "Who's still learning?" did that line land for you the way it landed for me? I read every single one. Stay soft, stay patient, and remember, the most powerful thing anyone can do is let another person earn their way back to the table, on their own terms, in their own time.